So we're going to go ahead and talk about neurological assessments today. So we're mainly looking at the history and tools in this first module lecture, specifically the history of neuropsychological assessment. And again, just broadly speaking, what defines this differently from other areas of assessment is that we're no longer trying to actually measure abstract constructs such as attitudes or personality. We're now trying to actually use measures of physical response, physical ability, sensory perception to determine or infer neuropsychological damage or lack of ability or impairment. And the neurology of it is specifically the physical structures of the nervous system and the brain. So neuropsychology is the branch of psychology that focuses on the relationship between brain function and behavior. So it's the study of the physical structure of the brain and the neurological systems of the body, and then that impact on behavior, which can include attitudes and personality. It started actually as a special area within clinical psychology and also the medical profession, and as well as psychiatry. But it has since emerged as a specialty in its own right. So where originally mainly you'd find that neuropsychologists were actually clinical psychologists that became interested in kind of the intersection between the physical structures of the body and the clinical diagnosis of psychopathologies, or normal human function. It has now become more of a branch that draws from clinical psychology, but also cognitive psychology and medical science. So neuropsychological assessment is the evaluation of brain and nervous system functions as it relates to behavior. So it's not necessarily just the physical structure of the brain and the physical structure of the nervous system. It is specifically the evaluation of those structures as it influences psychology. So again, how we act, how we behave, how we think. Cognition, behavior, and affect or feelings. There's many subspecialty areas, including pediatric neuropsychology, so basically how people from pre-birth all the way up to a quote-unquote adulthood develop. So basically the neuropsychological structures of how the brain is developing, how the neurological systems are developing, and how those change, and how those, sorry about that, not sure what that was, and how those changes influence behavior. Geriatric neuropsychology, so basically again, as we age and start entering into late adulthood, how again the physical changes in the neurological system affect behavior. Forensic neuropsychology, which has more of a overlap with clinical psychology, and also school neuropsychology. So again, looking at how potentially learning disabilities and issues in the educational system may also be influenced by the physical structures of the nervous system and the brain. So the need for neuropsychological assessments, it has a great impact and can be more easily verified than psychological effects. So the first thing is that if there is a neurological problem, a physical structural problem in either the brain or the nervous system that could impact behavior, these impacts often can be very severe. So a lot of more of the severe psychopathologies that we can think of, such as schizophrenia, definitely have a neurological or physical component. Also, a lot of severe learning disabilities have a physiological, in other words, a neurological component. So behavior and thinking is impacted and impaired due to some form of brain damage, lesion, or malfunction is what we're looking for. So what we're examining is the effects of this impairment from actual damage, malfunction, chemical imbalance in the physical structures that then result in impairment or change to behaviors or the psychology of the person we're examining. Another interesting area with neuropsychological assessment is that it's also usually more easily verified. So it's a little bit easier to measure these impairments. And that's what we're mainly going to focus on, is these kind of physiological measures of how people actually sense the world and how people interact with the world physically as kind of our marker of impairment or damage that's happening internally in the physical structures of the brain and nervous system. So common factors that we know result in neurological change, like I said, age. So from early childhood through adulthood, there are many physiological changes in how the brain functions, brain development, and also sensory development. And also, as we hit later adulthood, there is not only various diseases which can affect the neurological system that are associated with age, also aging in general does actually result in neurological change, a slowing down of the actual reaction systems. So our reflexes, our response time, our hand-eye coordination tend to go down with age, as well as some of our actual cognitive ability and processing abilities. Behavioral disorders due to chemical imbalance, including schizophrenia, but also we can be looking at brain injury and also brain disorders with physical defects. For example, Down syndrome is an example where there is physically structural differences in the brain and nervous system that then also result in impairment in normal, what we consider normal psychological function. So, kind of the history of connecting the physical structures of the body with the behavior of people. Um, Before we even get into some of the initial history, it's important to recognize that the idea that the brain, the physical structures, and the personality or psychological function of the person as a connected entity is a fairly recent concept. For the longest time in our history, even from kind of a scientific viewpoint, there was more of a belief of mind-body dualism, or the idea that the mind and the body were completely separate. So some of the early concepts, one of the very first, if you'll consider it a scientific theory, was phrenology by Gall. And it was the belief that intellect, thinking, and behavior was measured by surface of the skull. So it was a measure of basically bumps and divots in the skull to try to infer basically areas of the brain that may be more or less developed. Now, this has been completely debunked by modern science. There's no actual basis behind it, but it is the first time someone starts to go, is there a relationship between the structure of the brain and how someone behaves? Now, originally, phrenology was looking for basically correlational evidence. Was there differences in the surface area of the skull between criminals and non-criminals, between geniuses and non-geniuses? And initially, there was some what's often referred to as illusionary correlations. So, in a very small sample, for instance, there may have been some examples of people with a larger frontal cranial area also being smarter. And this is what kind of led to this idea that we could use these measurements to make inferences about the person's cognitive ability or behavioral or personality. However, as a larger and larger sample was done, as the theory became more developed, it quickly became obvious that this doesn't actually work. It was not predictive of anything. However, it did start the idea of connecting the physical structure with the actual mental structure. So that the brain itself and its physical structure had a very strong correlation or impact or influence on both our behavior, but also our attitudes and personality. So our first two big names in looking at neurological assessment were Broca and Wernicke, and they attributed certain parts of the brain to aphasia or different problems with speaking or understanding words. And this was again done by actually looking at people that had suffered brain damage. And what they were looking for is again correlations. They started to notice that as they were seeing patients that had suffered head injuries, that when people had received damage to various areas of the skull, which then corresponded with certain damage to the brain underneath the skull, they were seeing common patterns of basically impairment. So Broca, for instance, became famous for he noticed through a series of studies that if there was a damage to a very specific part of the brain, which eventually became known as Broca's area, that basically this disabled speech. So people that were damaged in this part of the brain could understand what was said to them. They could respond non-verbally, but they could no longer produce any kind of speech that made sense. Around approximately at the same time, a doctor named Wernicke was doing similar research and noticed that basically, and again, a separate area of the brain, when damaged, would result in people not being able to understand language spoken to them. So they still could think, their cognitions weren't influenced, often their personality wasn't influenced. However, their ability to actually understand other people's speech was impaired. So when people were speaking to them in a language they understood, it made no sense to them whatsoever. But again, they could often be communicated to non-verbally or through writing. About the same time, there was a case study of a man named Phineas Gage who basically suffered traumatic brain injury. And this also gave us two main areas of future research in neuropsychology. The first one was the acknowledgement that though there are definitely specific areas of the brain, according to Broca and Wernicke's research, that when damage happens to those areas, it has very specific and very severe impairment on behavior and function. But the brain also has what's often referred to as neuroplasticity. So there's large areas of the brain that actually can be damaged without major impairment in function. And Phineas's Gage damage basically illustrated that a large area of his brain had been damaged, but generally speaking, he was still able to communicate, he still understood speech, he still remembered most of his previous experiences and skills. But what Phineas Gage also taught us was that same damage also, according to everyone that he knew, friends and family, completely changed not only his personality, but also his inhibitions and his behaviors. So he was, quote unquote, a completely different person after the damage. So the next slide has just some illustrations of kind of what we've been talking about in this slide. So at the top left, we have an example of some of those initial phrenology maps, this idea of trying to actually map out the sections of the brain and what they control. The idea basically of a compartmentalized brain. Now again, the idea that you could then determine what parts of the brain were functioning and how well they were functioning by the surface of the cranium, bumps on your head, was discredited. This is actually an initial kind of conceptual model that we still understand as correct today, that the brain is, to some degree, has very specific areas that handle very specific processing. But at the same time, a lot of processing, a lot of personality and thinking is done broadly across the entirety of the neural net that is our minds. So to the right top, we also have examples of Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And again, these studies were done by people that had received damage to these areas of the brain. And this was often later would be confirmed once the person died through autopsies looking at their brains and finding this damage. And again, mapping that when you do receive traumatic damage to these two areas, you'll see common deficits in speech production, as in Broca's area, or speech understanding in Wernicke's area. The bottom set of pictures actually shows the damage that happened to Phineas Gage. So a large metal rod was shot through his head, resulting in blindness in one of his eyes, but also fairly severe damage to large portions of his brain. So we have the initial sketches done at the time, but we also have detailed information based on computer modeling and also scans of his autopsy and the actual remains that was left for science. And the final images there are a modern model of actually how much structural damage was done by the initial impact, but also then the swelling and the blood that would have been released in the brain. And we can see that about a third of his brain was affected by this damage. Now, luckily for him, if you will, it didn't hit any of these key areas that we now know are associated with speech understanding, speech production, and also memory creation and access. But it did still have a major effect on his personality and his behavior. So again, kind of these studies are all showing us how important that physical connection is to behavior. The mind and the brain are not separate entities. They're highly intercorrelated, highly connected. So moving into kind of modern neurological assessment, Arthur Benton is often thought of as the father of clinical neuropsychology. He was a clinical psychologist that started really examining what the medical science was saying about brain structures and their function, and how to actually start mapping on psychological or clinical issues onto these various physical components. Just kind of an interesting side note, Alfred Bandura, the person that basically is responsible for a lot of our theories in social psychology, you may know him as the scientist that actually did the Bobo doll experiments on aggression, was one of his students. We also have at the same time Wald Halston and Ralph Retton. They studied brain damaged patients and also started to develop specific tests based on observing patients. So they're the ones that started to look at people that they knew had suffered a specific and fairly traumatic brain injury. And they started to actually come up with a series of physical tests that would then be able to detect if that brain damage had occurred when you didn't know the damage had occurred. So if someone comes in with a rod through their head, for instance, you very much have a very good idea of where the damage is, and you can then look for this kind of impairment. But what if that damage is due to a birth defect? What if that damage is due to a chemical imbalance? What if that damage is due to an internal stroke that there's no outward necessarily force that caused that damage? The idea was to start to develop tests, physical tests, that anyone could come in, and you wouldn't necessarily need to be doing a brain scan or an MRI. You could simply start to infer what damage or impairment had occurred based on their performance of various physical tasks and also sensory perception tasks. So these tests that he developed included number and letter sequencing, so basically the ability to use both short-term and long-term memory. Controlled oral word association, so kind of examining the ability for someone to understand speech and reproduce speech. Halstead categories tests, so the ability for people to make associations. Tactile performance tests, so that's kind of being able to do various physical tasks based on feelings, so using your hands. Rhythm tests, which we're looking at the ability to recognize differences in sounds and rhythms, so basically looking at sensory perception of sound. Speech sound perception tests, again, further delineation of how people are understanding complex sounds. Finger oscillation tests, again, more kind of fine motor control. And all of these tests started to create kind of the what would become the standards of how we use neurological assessment to determine, is there a physical issue in the brain and nervous system that might be resulting in behavioral or personality impairment or difficulty or change. So all of this is kind of based on the brain, and this is a very simplistic model of brain structure. But kind of broadly speaking, that we have the hindbrain, which is the base of the brain near the medulla oblongata. It basically controls both basic voluntary functions, including breathing. And breathing is both an involuntary and a voluntary function. We don't have to think about breathing, but we can also control our breathing. Same with swallowing, also to some degree heart rate, hand-eye coordination. So the hindbrain has a lot of autonomic systems, so basically things that we're not directly in control with, but also is kind of got the areas of the brain that allows us to take control of these systems in certain situations. The midbrain then controls head and reception of senses, so damages to this area often will have direct impact on our ability to actually understand or interpret what we're gathering in as far as our senses, so sense of smell, hearing, sight, touch. There's 12 cranial nerves in this area, and damage to those nerves have been found to be associated with our ability to do eye movements, locating sound, detecting smells, facial sensations, tasting, etc. And then we also finally have the forebrain. So in the deep middle of the brain, of the forebrain, is where most of our memory, motor control, visual recognition, and auditory visual perceptions come from. However, as we move out to the exterior of the forebrain, that's where we also find a lot of our cognition, our cognitive ability, our behavior, and our emotions, and those areas are more spread out throughout the brain.